Now, I'm glad that I've known most of you as long as I have, because I have a bit of a confession to make, and it's a bit of an unusual one for chapel. But I've been thinking a lot about sex recently. Brought a smile to a couple of faces back there. In fact, for the past year or more, I started the work last summer when we were here. I've been working on a manuscript for a book that's now completed, not yet published, called The Missing Sex Link: Darwin's Blind Spot and Human Evolution's Undoing. The premise of the book is pretty simple, and I don't know why we haven't talked about this more among believers who have always wanted to challenge evolution in whatever way that we could. We've overlooked something that seems to me very simple but very powerful. We hear a lot of talk about the missing link, of course, between typically apes and man. But that's not the missing link that is the most important missing link. The evolutionists can explain all that away, as you know. They're very adept at doing that. What they cannot explain is what evolution cannot explain. There is evolution, but evolution cannot explain the origin of sex. And if you think about that in the wider scope of Darwinian thinking, it is the Achilles heel of Darwinian evolution. Now, when I say that evolution happens, of course, within species there is change. That is a form of evolution. But the grand theory that Darwin had, that all things came from the simplest organism to the most complex, that all things came by slight modification over long periods of time, that all things came by a process of natural selection in the survival of the fittest forms. That grand theory has been foisted upon the world ever since Darwin came up with it, and the consequences have been profound, not only for the world, but also for the church. Because in effect, what you do with Darwinian theory is you eliminate God. And when you eliminate God, there is no basis for morality, and we're going to see that as this unfolds. So profound cultural implications as to whether or not the grand theory of Darwin's thinking is true. Now, the Achilles heel is this. This is not terribly technical. Just think about this for a moment. By the theory of evolution, the smallest, least complex organisms ever known began as asexual, that is, non-sexual beings. They replicated like a Xerox machine. Copy, 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 exact copy. Now, there are still billions of organisms out there that replicate that way. And within our own body, there are cells that replicate by simply copying. So in our world today, I guess we would say they make selfies. Whatever, they're taking a picture of themselves, and that's what comes out. Well, that's well and good, and in biological terms, that's called mitosis. It's a process of mitosis, self-copying, self-replication. But for another bunch of billions of organisms, they don't replicate by copying, they reproduce sexually. Now, that includes us, of course, but it's also most grass, trees, flowers, fish, birds, all the other animal life that's out there. They reproduce sexually, which means that there have to be two individuals that make that happen. Each of them sheds exactly half, what an interesting detail, exactly half of their chromosomes, mix them together in a mixing bowl, and what comes out may have some family resemblance, but every product of that union is unique and different, and there is never anyone, not even identical twins, are exactly identical. Never have been, never will be. So, think about this from a logical standpoint. If you have copy, copy, copy in a process of mitosis, And over here you have something quite different, which they call meiosis, which is this sexual reproduction. You bring the copying forward as far as you possibly can and the sexual reproduction back as far as you possibly can. Not all the billions of years in the world is going to solve this problem, because at some juncture in real time, there had to be mutations, whatever it was, that moved from the copying process to the sexual reproduction process. And here's what's most fascinating about that. Two things. One is, you'd have to have a male and a female. If you had a mutation that maybe came up with the male, and I'm talking about the simplest level, I'm not talking about a complex human being, I'm talking about the simplest possible level, you still got to have a male and a female for sexual reproduction. So, you'd have to have both a male and a female. One without the other isn't going to work. And they would have to be in geographic proximity in order to mate, with all the bells and whistles of mating that they'd have even at the simplest level, and the new reproductive process. And they'd have to like each other in order to mate. And they would have to produce, after their union, both a male and a female to get to the next generation. Millions and billions of years don't work when you need everything together at the same time. Does that make sense to you? That the process of evolution cannot explain the origin of male and female. Well, if there's no male and female that can explain that, and no process jumping from mitosis to meiosis, from non-sexual to sexual, you can't get the grand theory of evolution. Does that make sense? There's no way that evolution can explain that. It's the Achilles heel. Darwin himself said that if any major organ could not be achieved by slight modification, my theory absolutely breaks down, quote unquote. His own test. Sexual reproduction cannot be explained by slight modification. If you think about it, the male sexual organ, half of it, the female sexual organ, half of it, isn't going to do you any good. That's slight modification. Unless you have everything there in place, mating capabilities, reproductive capabilities, all at the same time, male and female, two genders, then evolution doesn't work. And yet our world is basing not only its scientific assumptions, but its philosophical assumptions on this theory. It's an amazing thing to me that this is the greatest scientific fraud ever perpetrated on humankind. And yet the brightest of us don't seem to understand this. The reason I want to read from Genesis chapter 1, or from Romans chapter 1, is that it talks about another group of people who had the same problem. Verse 18, Romans 1, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. I just don't understand when you look at the gardens and open gardens at Ashton Under Hill. You look at the flowers in your own garden. You look at the birds. How does that work? Did that just magically happen? Did that happen randomly by chance? There is not a chance in the world that that could have happened by chance. Even the single blade of grass, the weed that you pull up. I don't know what God was thinking when he made weeds, but when he did, he made them. And they're complicated, and they reproduce sexually. It's an amazing thing. And yet we take it all for granted, and the wisest of the wise among us say, oh, it all just happened by accident. The distance of the sun from the earth. Slightly further away and we freeze, slightly closer and we burn up. It all happened by accident. The Big Bang Theory, I could go on and on and on and on. The Big Bang Theory is a big bust. And it's because of mathematical assumptions that they're making. But they're not they're not thinking correctly. And I'm not going to go any further into that, but it's just amazing that that's the case. They should know God, but although they know God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claim to be wise, and I'm telling you, I have read head-spinning stuff from the experts, claiming to be wise. They are fools. Changing the immortal God was made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Well, whether you knew about the missing sex link or not, I suspect most of you in here would have had some real problems with the theory of evolution. What's striking to me is that the world blithely assumes Darwinian evolution as the explanation for life. But that's not what amazes me. What amazes me is that now, increasingly, scholars in the church are buying off on a form of evolution, which has been around for a long time, but it's called theistic evolution. Well, yes, God created the universe, but he did it by a process of evolution through natural selection. I'm sorry, but I don't get this. The brightest of the brightest in the church now going toward some kind of hope for amalgamation between creation and divine creation and evolution? Do they not understand that there would have to be an incredible oxymoron to say theistic evolution? Because it's either natural selection, where God is completely out of the process, as Darwin insisted, or there is supernatural selection, where God is very much purposely in the picture, having an end result in mind, having us in mind, and a world that's completely suitable for us in mind. That could not have happened by millions and millions and millions and millions of factors that all would have to come together randomly somehow or another for what we have around us. But in the church today, evolution is invading the church. That's the scariest thing to me. Now, what's also interesting is that Paul is not talking to atheists. He's talking about Gentiles who were pagans, but the pagans believed in gods. At least they believed in gods, something greater than ourselves. Now, they were so mistaken because their gods were creatures that they worshiped. Idols were made reflecting things in nature. We're not even pagans today. We're post-Christian and we are post-pagan, because now we have a secular society that does not even recognize plural gods, much less a single God. And you wonder why ISIS is saying there is but one God. They have something to say to the world. Muslims have something to say to the world, that there is a God and that there is one God. But the people that I'm reading from today, outside the church and inside the church, are scarily going toward a philosophy that either up front you toss God out, or the implications of your thinking, the implications are that there couldn't be a God there, that it all happened naturally. So when we think in that term, I have to go back to Psalm 14. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They're not wise. They are fools. Richard Dawkins and all the others put together, their complete brilliance, all harmonized together. It is fools squared. Fools times fools is fools squared. That's what that is in Psalm 14. Now, the tie-in that we need to understand is the second part of that first verse there, moving to the second. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. If that is the case, what's the follow-up? They are corrupt, their deeds are vile, there is no one who does good. What we think of origins has everything to do with what we think about everything else, but certainly about the philosophy of life, the origin of life, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, why we're here, and what kind of standards we're going to live by. If you put God out of the picture completely, totally, trust me, you wouldn't want to live in a society where there was no God. Where there's no God, there's no good or evil. If there's no God. You can't have morality without God. Church people who are trying to amalgamate faith and science in the way that they're doing just simply do not understand that you can't get away with that because ideas have consequences. And the greatest consequence has to do with morality or the lack thereof. And so we see in Romans 1, chapter 24, therefore, because they didn't understand God, therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen.